So when you think about joining an exclusive club, you usually expect a pretty clear set of rules. You pay the dues, you meet the dress code, you wait your turn in line, and eventually you're in.
Right. I mean, it's supposed to be transactional,
Mhm.
objective. Everyone understands the criteria right from the jump.
Exactly. But imagine you finally get to the front of the line and the bouncer just stops you and says, actually, to get in, you have to legally change your name, let the guy standing behind you rewrite your family history, and oh yeah, officially agree that your grandfather wasn't who you always thought he was.
Yeah, that is no longer about club rules.
No.
That just becomes a full-blown existential crisis right there on the sidewalk.
And that completely bizarre, incredibly frustrating scenario is exactly what we're unpacking today. Welcome to the deep dive. We are looking at the Republic of Macedonia, which is, well, now officially known as North Macedonia. And we're using it as this profound case study of what happens when a nation's internal psychology, its historical identity, and the cold, bureaucratic demands of the New World Order violently collide.
It really is a perfect storm. It's internal vulnerability meeting this immense, almost crushing external pressure.
Totally. And to do this, we are pulling from a massive stack of sources today for you. We've got deep geopolitical analyses, the psychological critiques of Dr. Samuel Vaknin, right down to the incredibly complex historical disputes of the Balkans.
And it's worth noting right here at the top, the material we're decoding today contains some highly charged political claims.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we are looking at right-wing perspectives, left-wing analyses, institutional mandates, and fiercely anti-institutional viewpoints. So just to be completely clear, we aren't here to take a side or endorse any specific government's agenda.
No, not at all. Our mission is just to impartially decode what these sources are saying.
Right. We're simply laying out the map so you can see exactly where the landmines are buried. Okay, let's unpack this.
So, to understand how a country finds itself completely paralyzed on the global stage, you can't just look at its foreign policy. I mean, you have to look at the internal architecture first.
You have to see how the state actually functions, or I guess fails to function from the inside out.
Exactly. And this is where Dr. Samuel Vaknin's critique really sets the stage. Now, as a former economic advisor to the Macedonian government, his diagnosis is, well, it's brutal.
Yeah, he doesn't pull any punches. He doesn't just say the country is struggling. He flat out calls it a failed or a captured state. And he uses terms like the deep state, which, usually conjures up these images of shadowy figures in basement meetings.
Right, like an occult conspiracy. But he's talking about something much more structural. He's describing a highly visible, entrenched network of patronage.
Like a system that just completely transcends whichever political party happens to win a given election.
Precisely. It doesn't matter who is in office. He points to this gray economy that's ruled by a small group of oligarchs. I mean, these are essentially robber barons who consolidated all their wealth and power during that chaotic privatization era of the 1990s.
Ah, right. When the state-owned assets from the old Yugoslav system were essentially just liquidated for pennies to political insiders.
Exactly. And the thing is, those insiders never really left. The sources constantly bring up this term, intergenerational elites.
Meaning the former communist structures didn't just vanish when democracy supposedly arrived?
No, they just bought new suit. They rebranded their political parties and just maintained this informal iron grip on the judiciary, the media, the intelligence services.
So it's honestly like a hostile corporate takeover where the old corrupt board of directors never actually resigns, right? They just change the company logo and convince the employees they finally have a say, when in reality the exact same people are pulling the strings to avoid accountability.
That visual captures the dynamic perfectly. And what's fascinating here is that Vaknin frames this entire setup as a postmodern autocracy.
A postmodern autocracy, meaning what exactly?
Meaning you don't need military parades or secret police disappearing people in the middle of the night anymore.
Right.
You just use the trappings of democracy.
Like parliamentary debates and elections.
Yeah, elections, legal frameworks.
Yeah.
You use them merely as a mask for a criminalized plutocracy. The whole system is explicitly designed to look functional while being entirely hollowed out on the inside.
But, I mean, how does the population just accept that? Why isn't there mass revolt? This is where Vaknin brings in this really fascinating psychological angle, right? Because he's an expert on narcissism.
He is. And he applies that psychological lens to the entire country with a concept he actually coined, the Macedonian couch.
The Macedonian couch. Okay, break that down for us.
So, the Macedonian couch is this crucial mechanism. Vaknin argues that the populace suffers from a deep form of collective trauma. When you look at the history of the region, I mean, you've got centuries of Ottoman rule, followed by various Balkan wars, and then Yugoslav communism.
Right. It's just a continuous pattern of external domination.
Exactly. And that history breeds a collective learned helplessness. The population is historically conditioned to expect the state to be abusive or corrupt.
Oh, wow. So it's almost like a societal Stockholm syndrome.
That's a great way to put it. So when leaders with highly narcissistic or even psychopathic traits take power, leaders who view the state treasury as their own private property, the public reaction isn't revolution.
It's resignation.
Yes, they just lie back on the metaphorical couch and accept this pathological leadership as the natural order of things.
And that internal rot, that resignation, is exactly what makes the country so vulnerable on the global stage. I mean, if your leaders are treating the state like a personal piggy bank, you lose the institutional armor you need to defend your sovereignty.
Internal weakness invariably invites external dominance. If your judiciary is completely compromised and your economy is mostly informal, you just can't effectively negotiate with global heavyweights.
Which brings us to what the sources call the international overlords. Vaknin points the finger directly at these supranational structures, the IMF, the World Bank, the European Union.
Right. He argues they treat small, vulnerable nations less like sovereign partners and much more like protectorates. The phrase he uses is a puppeteered hierarchy.
A puppeteered hierarchy. Okay, so a hierarchy implies a system with, multiple nodes of power, rather than a strict top-down hierarchy.
Right. But by adding puppeteered, he's saying that while there are local mayors, prime ministers, and judges, these local politicians are essentially just reduced to middle management.
So they aren't actually governing a sovereign nation, they're just managing the local franchise on behalf of foreign interests.
Exactly. And the ultimate undeniable example of this in the sources is the Prespa Agreement.
Oh man, the Prespa Agreement. This was the historic deal where the country actually changed its constitutional name from the Republic of Macedonia to North Macedonia.
Yes. And they did this specifically to appease Greece, who had blocked their path to Western integration for literally decades over the name issue.
Changing your country's name to satisfy a neighbor and a supranational union is, it's the absolute pinnacle of external coercion overriding national identity. But wait, let me push back on this Vaknin assessment for a second.
Sure.
Aren't institutions like the EU and the IMF supposed to be the stabilizing good guys in this scenario, helping the country modernize its economy and strengthen the rule of law?
Well, that is the official brochure, right?
Right.
And certainly the stated goal of these institutions is stability, modernization, and democratic integration.
Yeah.
But the reality experienced on the ground is a profound erosion of sovereignty. Yeah. In this critique, the global order isn't some shadowy cabal. It's just a very visible, informal alliance of convenience.
An alliance between the corrupt local politicians and global financial interests.
Exactly. They benefit each other. The international bodies get regional stability, compliance, and, a buffer zone against other geopolitical rivals like Russia or China.
And in return, the local elites get international funding, loans to prop up their budgets, and basically a blind eye turned to their domestic corruption.
Precisely. They feed off each other at the expense of the average citizen who just has to watch their identity and agency get traded away in these backroom deals.
It's just wild. But that dynamic can feel a bit abstract until you look at how it plays out with specific countries. To really see this bureaucratic trap in action, we have to look at the two biggest power players in the EU, France and Germany.
Yes. Their handling of Macedonia's attempt to join the EU is honestly a masterclass in geopolitical whiplash. Let's start with France.
Okay, because France's role is viewed with immense bitterness in Macedonia, right? This goes back to October 2019.
Right. French President Emmanuel Macron issued this sudden expansion veto. He single-handedly blocked the opening of accession talks for Macedonia and Albania.
And the timing of that veto was just devastating. Macedonia had just swallowed the massive, painful pill of the Prespa Agreement. They changed their name, they altered their constitution, they alienated a huge portion of their own population.
All based on the explicit promise that doing so would immediately unlock the EU doors.
Exactly. And the second they did it, Macron steps in and says, hold on. The EU needs to reform itself internally before we take on any new members. The sources describe it as being viewed as a profound generational betrayal.
It completely shattered public trust in the whole European integration process. But France's involvement became even more controversial a few years later. in 2022.
Right, because following the French veto, Bulgaria stepped in with its own veto, blocking Macedonia over these deep historical disputes.
And then France returns to supposedly broker a compromise to lift that Bulgarian blockade. This became known as the French proposal.
The notorious French proposal, which is widely considered a poisoned apple in the sources. So wait, let me make sure I have the actual mechanics of this right. The proposal didn't just delay the process. It legally required Macedonia to amend its constitution to include the Bulgarian minority as a mandatory prerequisite for even starting the real EU negotiations.
That is exactly the mechanism. It effectively Bulgarianized the entire EU accession process. It took a messy bilateral neighborhood argument over history and turned it into actual binding EU law.
That's insane. It legitimizes the maximalist demands of one current member state and just forces them onto the weaker candidate country.
It sends a very clear message. The EU will side with the stronger power to get a quick diplomatic win off their desk, regardless of what it costs the weaker nation's sovereignty.
And then on the other side, you have Germany. Now, Germany is widely seen as Macedonia's strongest advocate in the EU, but the sources describe it as this very exhausting, tough love kind of relationship.
Yeah, Berlin initiated the Berlin process back in 2014, ostensibly to keep the Western Balkans on track for integration. But more than a decade later, that process has essentially resulted in just endless summits, working groups, and, group photos.
Yielding massive enlargement fatigue among the public.
Exactly. Germany acts as the regional broker, but their priority is regional stability and supply chain security. It's not necessarily Macedonian identity.
So Berlin frequently puts immense pressure on Skopje to just accept these painful compromises and move on.
Right. And you have to add a stark economic imbalance to that.
Yes.
Germany is Macedonia's largest trading partner. This creates a deep dependency.
Right. So Macedonia is providing this steady stream of cheap labor and raw materials for German industry, but they receive none of the political protections or the full economic benefits of actual EU membership. It sounds like Germany is the strict parent making you eat your vegetables because it's for your own good, while France is the erratic bouncer arbitrarily changing the VIP entry rules the second you reach the front of the line.
That's a great analogy. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, you see how Western European domestic politics constantly trump Balkan stability. French politicians worry about alienating domestic voters who are skeptical of EU enlargement, so Paris hits the brakes.
And German industry needs a stable, cheap backyard, so Berlin demands quick compromises.
Exactly. The candidate country is simply caught in the middle of these competing domestic agendas.
Which brings us to the core of the current crisis. Here's where it gets really interesting. Why was the 2022 French proposal considered such a toxic, poisoned apple by the Macedonian public?
Because it weaponized history. It forced a deeply emotional, existential dispute with Bulgaria into the cold machinery of EU bureaucracy.
And keeping our impartiality hat firmly on, let's break down these conflicting narratives. Because the core of the dispute is a battle over who has the rightful claim to the history, the language, and the historical heroes of the region.
Right. The Joint Historical Commission, which was set up to find common ground, has instead morphed into the zero-sum battlefield of national narratives. Take the historical figure Goja Delijev, for example.
Right, a prominent leader of the revolutionary movement against the Ottoman Empire at the turn of the 20th century. Bulgaria points to his education in Bulgarian schools and various historical documents to claim him as ethnically Bulgarian.
But for Macedonia, Delijev isn't just some historical figure. He's the foundational symbol of their struggle for independence. And if Bulgaria successfully claims him, they are implicitly claiming that the foundation of the Macedonian state is an artificial construct.
You see the exact same dynamic with Tsar Samuel, right? Bulgaria claims his medieval empire was a Bulgarian empire, while Macedonia views it as a Macedonian Slavic empire centered in Ohrid.
Even the Ilinden uprising of 1903 against the Ottomans is fiercely contested. Bulgaria views it as a Bulgarian revolt. For Macedonians, it is the absolute cornerstone of their national holiday and their modern statehood.
And then, on top of all the historical figures, you have the profound dispute over language. Bulgaria officially refuses to recognize Macedonian as a distinct independent language.
Yes, they argue it's merely a regional dialect of Bulgarian that was artificially codified and separated by Yugoslav communists under Tito after 1944.
While the Macedonian side counters with evidence of a distinct literary tradition, unique grammar, and, the fact that the United Nations officially recognized Macedonian as a separate language way back in 1970.
The EU attempted to navigate this minefield in the French proposal, by using the term Macedonian language.
Yeah.
But they compromised by allowing Bulgaria to attach a unilateral declaration stating they formally do not recognize it.
Wow. And perhaps the most raw, sensitive area of this entire dispute is the World War II narrative. Sofia demands that Macedonia remove the term Bulgarian fascist occupier from historical monuments and textbooks.
Right. Bulgaria argues that their forces were merely administrators or even liberators.
But this touches on incredibly deep generational trauma. I mean, Macedonians point to the reality of the Axis occupation between 1941 and 1944, specifically the deportation of the vast majority of the Jewish population from Macedonia to the Treblinka extermination camp under Bulgarian authority.
Yes. For the Macedonian public, removing the word occupier feels like a direct attempt to whitewash the Holocaust and erase their lived historical trauma.
And this is where the sheer mechanics of the EU trap become terrifying. These aren't just like academic debates happening in some university library. Because of the French proposal, these specific historical interpretations are now embedded in the EU framework.
Exactly. Every time a new EU chapter opens, it requires a unanimous vote from all member states.
So Bulgaria holds a legal veto over Macedonia at every single step of a process that usually takes years, if not decades.
They can effectively hold the country hostage indefinitely. They can demand new textbook changes, monument alterations, or linguistic concessions at every single turn.
I mean, for you listening, just imagine your neighbor being given the legal authority to dictate what you are allowed to call your own grandfather before the city will connect your house to the power grid.
That is exactly the level of coercion we're talking about here. It feels to the public like an attempt to erase a unique identity.
So having traced all these colliding forces, the psychological vulnerability of this captured state, the opportunistic pressure of the international overlords, the EU bottlenecks, and this deeply emotional historical trap, we arrive at the present day, March 2026.
Yes, and the result is a massive, seemingly intractable stalemate.
Total gridlock. Prime Minister Christian Mikoski, whose government took power in 2024, has drawn a hard line in the sand with a strict no-changes stance. He is flat out refusing those constitutional amendments required by the French proposal.
His platform rests on two main demands: reciprocity and guarantees. He argues if Macedonia is forced to alter its constitution to recognize a Bulgarian minority, then Bulgaria must reciprocate and recognize the Macedonian minority living within its borders.
Which, the sources point out, would just be honoring the multiple rulings of the European Court of Human Rights that already mandate Bulgaria do so.
Exactly. And his second demand is an ironclad, legally binding guarantee from the EU that this constitutional change is the absolute final demand, so Bulgaria can't just weaponize history to veto them again next year.
But the EU hasn't budged, right? Their response has been what analysts are calling the decoupling.
Right. For years, Macedonia and Albania were grouped together, moving through the accession process side by side. But as of late 2024 and early 2026, the EU allowed Albania to decouple and move forward with their negotiating chapters,
Leaving Macedonia entirely stuck at step one because they refused to pass that constitutional prerequisite. So how has this played with the public? I have to imagine enthusiasm is just completely tanking.
Oh, resistance to what they call the Bulgarian diktat is sky high. Historically, enthusiasm for joining the EU sat at a massive 90% in Macedonia. It was the unquestioned national goal.
Wow, 90%.
Yeah, but today, that number has plummeted to 71%, and the trend line is pointing sharply downward. The enlargement fatigue has metastasized into outright cynicism.
And the EU is trying to break this deadlock with the only tool it really understands, which is money. There was a proposal from some Macedonian analysts for a structural safeguard, right?
Yes, a compromise, where the parliament would pass the constitutional amendment now, but it would have a delayed trigger only taking effect on the exact day Macedonia officially becomes a full EU member.
Which seems logical, but both Bulgaria and the EU flatly rejected it. Instead, the EU is leaning heavily on financial leverage through the Reform and Growth Facility. They're dangling hundreds of millions of euros for economic projects, but with the strict condition that the political track won't move an inch without the constitutional change.
So what does this all mean for the listener? I mean, if the EU says amend or stay in the waiting room, and Bulgaria says no changes without reciprocity, is this just a permanent geopolitical traffic jam?
This raises an important question about the limits of bureaucratic power. You know, the EU operates on this transactional logic, assuming the promise of economic growth will eventually just force compliance.
Right. They think everyone has a price. Exactly. But when a population perceives a demand as a direct existential attack on their sovereign identity and historical memory, transactional economics stop working. It's a profound clash between the spreadsheets of Brussels diplomacy and the visceral reality of Balkan identity.
We have covered incredible ground today. We started with Vaknin's psychological diagnosis of a state where entrenched elites and collective trauma just leave the doors wide open.
We saw how that internal rot invited supranational institutions to treat the country like a managed franchise.
We navigated the sheer whiplash of EU bureaucracy, from French vetoes to German economic dependency, and we walked right into the emotional minefield of historical identity with Bulgaria, landing us in the absolute political gridlock of March 2026.
It's a dense, often deeply frustrating narrative, but it's vital for understanding modern statecraft. And I want to leave everyone with a final thought to mull over.
Go for it.
If a supranational organization requires a nation to fundamentally alter its historical memory, change its name, and rewrite its constitutional identity just for the economic privilege of joining the market, does that union actually value the diversity it claims to champion? Or is economic integration just a modern, highly bureaucratic form of assimilation?
Wow. The door to the club might technically be open, but the price of admission might just be who you are. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking beneath the surface, and we will catch you next time.